And we're back with our roundtable of elected officials and campaign experts. I want to go to Amy Klobuchar because one of the things immediately after this election, the president and congressional leaders are going to have to decide, do they want to call the Congress back for a lame duck session and deal with these extensions of the Bush tax cuts? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think ought to happen?
I think we have to do that. The middle class has to get more than a few Tootsie Rolls in their treat bag for Halloween here. We just can't keep this policy of having the wealthiest get the biggest chunk of these tax cuts. So extending the tax cuts for the middle class, then looking at what we should do with the wealthiest when we have a trillion-some-dollar budget deficit. There's two proposals out there, Bob. One is that we could continue the $250,000 and above tax cuts for the Bush tax cuts for another year or two and then phase them out. Or we could immediately say, for people making over $1 million, your tax cuts are done, you get them up to $1 million, and then you go back to the Clinton levels. I just don't think that that is going to disrupt our economy. In fact, things were a lot better when Bill Clinton was president. So those are two compromises that have been out there. But clearly, we have to do a combination of making sure the middle class get these tax cuts, then at the same time figuring out how we do it so that we get some money back on the deficit.
Do you think they'll act on this after the election?
Yeah, I think something has to be done. And actually, it's only the last few weeks we've heard any talk of compromise at all. But I think we should extend the tax cuts. As John Kennedy said, a good Democrat back in 1963, a rising tide lifts all boats. We shouldn't get into class warfare. And the so-called millionaires, many of them are small businesses, and they're the small businesses that produce a great number of the jobs that are the engine of our economy. I believe the worst thing to do is sort of raising taxes on anyone as we're trying to come out of this economic recession.
Governor, how do you pay for this, though? That's
You can't. And the truth is, and Americans are going to have to deal with this sooner or later, if you extend all the tax cuts for another 10 years, it adds $4 trillion to the deficit. Everything else, all the government spending, is minuscule compared to what it would add. What I would do if I were king of the world, what I would do is I'd extend the middle class tax cuts for 2 years, eliminate everything else, and even phase the middle class tax cuts out and get us back to Clinton levels after the economy recovers. It's the only way we're going to get control of the deficit, and we have to start talking honestly to the American people. The Republicans, no offense to Peter, who's a very good guy, but the Republicans say the deficit's the most important. Oh yeah, except when tax cuts are concerned, we're going to add $4 trillion to the deficit.
Governor Pawlenty out there, you've been traveling around the country. How concerned are people? Do you see that as the #1 issue out there right now? I mean, I think we all agree the economy's in the dump, and that's the overriding issue. But this idea of these, what to do about these tax cuts?
Well, Bob, when you ask the American people, you talk to them in the bakeries or hardware stores or in gatherings, what they'll tell you first and foremost, of course, is jobs, as you noted. But secondly is government spending. And they want it reduced, and they want the economy also to move forward positively. In my view, history shows and good economic theory shows if you reduce taxes, you're going to have more economic activity. If you don't extend those Bush tax cuts, all of them, it's going to send a very negative signal to the economy. It's going to be counterproductive. But on the spending side, we shouldn't just talk about paying for tax cuts. We should also talk about paying for the spending in the federal government that's on autopilot. And we need to have, as Ed Rendell said, a very honest discussion, look the American people in the camera and say there's going to have to be, in the eye, and say there's going to have to be some changes, and particularly in the entitlement programs. And we're going to have to start bringing up those issues and be open and transparent and candid about it. But we can't get federal government spending under control unless you're willing to tackle those entitlement programs. That's what's going to cause the problem. I
just want to talk a little straight politics here. Now, all of you have been out campaigning for one person or another. Give me your idea, Senator Klobuchar, of the races we ought to be watching.
Well, first of all, I feel good about the Senate right now in terms of what's going to happen at the end of this election. I think we're winning California. I think we're ahead in Washington. 75% of the votes there have already been cast. You look over in West Virginia, where Governor Manchin has pretty much opened up a lead there. And then you go across the country, and you see things in Alaska where the Republican candidate there came out in favor of getting rid of the minimum wage. They're going down. My friend Michael Bennett in Colorado is in a tight race in Colorado, but doing incredibly well. There's just, you go through the state, and I think people have just stepped back a little and say, we want to continue to govern and move forward, and we're concerned about the extreme views of some of these candidates.
We were very tight on time here, Congressman.
In New York, we can take 5 or 6 seats. Right now, it's 27-2. We can take 5, 6, 7 seats. A race to look at, John Laughlin, Rhode Island won Patrick Kennedy's seat. I think we're going to take that back.
Sestak, Toomey in Pennsylvania, we're going to hold the Senate regardless. Amy's right. But if Joe Sestak wins, we're going to have a very comfortable margin in the Senate.
And Governor Pawlenty out there in Minnesota.
Well, as Vice Chair of the Republican Governors Association, I'll focus on the governor's races. Bob will go from 24 to at least 30 and probably well north of 30. You're going to see a couple surprises there, maybe in Maine, but you'll also see most of the Great Lakes states switch from mostly blue now back to red. That's going to be a bellwether for things to come.
All right. Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for being with us this morning. It's always fun to talk about politics. Of course, the sign of the times, we had to start the broadcast this morning with the latest on terrorism because it's the issue that hangs over all of this, and it is, and we just have to recognize that.